It is a wonderful honor to welcome Professor Samuel Moyn to this podcast. He is the professor of law and history at Yale University. And in this hour, we're discussing his new book, Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Times. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let us begin. It's a very interesting book. The premise of it, I certainly find some disagreements with it actually, because I kind of consider myself a child of that particular intellectual tradition, the Cold War liberals. So I think it's going to be exciting. So tell me, what how would you define liberalism, starting from what it is and also what it is not?
Well, I don't believe that you can give a definition of a tradition that isn't it is not taking sides within it or against it. It would be like asking, how do you define Christianity? In fact, Christianity is a set of struggles over controlling a movement and later an institution. And I'm more interested then in how people construct that tradition. So in the case of liberalism, I am attentive to how in the middle of the 20th century, a lot of liberals said that liberalism needed to change. And in so doing, it needed to abandon some of what earlier liberals had considered their own sources, like the Enlightenment and Jean-Jacques Rousseau as part of it, and the French Revolution, and even later figures like G.W.F. Hegel, or Karl Marx, who was helpful for many liberals in the 19th century as they updated liberalism. So I think clearly that in liberalism, there's a longstanding set of agreements that all liberals share, like a commitment to freedom defined some way or other, and a skepticism of the state and state power, although reliance on it at the same time. But beyond that, liberalism can't be defined because it's a set of disagreements about what to make liberalism, what freedom means, what it requires of the state, and so forth.
So tell me, how would you characterize Cold War liberalism?
Well, Cold War liberals are those who say that uh, the emergency of freedom in the era of the totalitarian state requires placing strict limits, not just on the state, which all liberals believe, but on really the very ambition which liberals had embraced before to institutionalize freedom and equality. So, the so-called new liberals of the late 19th century, sometimes called progressives in American history, claimed that freedom and equality aren't naturally occurring, that they have to be built in and through our institutions. So that liberalism is about using state power, among other tools, to emancipate individuals and to make them equal. And the Cold War liberals renounce all that because they say that these are totalitarian ideas in intent or effect. And what they succeed in doing is creating a whole bunch of heirs who think that there really is no other kind of liberalism than a libertarian one, who think that John Locke was the founder of liberalism, who think that any attempt uh, to use state power to emancipate is illiberal. And I think that was a considerable success on the part of Cold War liberals. My trouble with it is whether it's, whether, it made sense in its time or not. I think it's been uh, uh, devastating to the liberal cause. We're looking around the world at liberal regimes that are giving up on the very ideas that Cold War liberals championed. So I worry then that this attempt to redefine liberalism in the middle of the 20th century proves self-defeating. And the question is whether we can save liberalism from its dire straits today.
I see. Um, so one interesting fact I read from the book is that John Locke, whom you mentioned, was not canonized as a founder of modern liberalism until the 20th century. So I wonder, before that, well, who were part of that canon?
Well, so the first liberals self-styled appear in the 1820s and 30s in continental Europe, and they thought of themselves as heirs of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And um, they uh, they didn't kind of move to construct a, a university course in liberalism. So compared to the 20th century, when we have many courses about John Locke and his successors, I think um, it's hard to kind of give you like a reading list, because someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau would be on there, but Montesquieu might be. Within a few decades, it's clear that people like Alexis de Tocqueville, John Stuart Mill would be, some of the leaders, and there were, German equivalents to. Americans embrace liberalism by name really only after World War One, surprisingly late. And so it's at that point that, really, due to the fact that a lot of people are become quite concerned about the Soviet Union and its promises of a classless society and its attack on private property, that John Locke is retroactively anointed the founding father of liberalism, because he insists on pre-political property rights as the basis of the state. So that is, I think that occurs before Cold War liberalism as such crystallized. There are, around the time of World War One, there are a fair number of people already who say John Locke was the first liberal, not just liberals, but also Marxists like Harold Lasky in his great book of 1930-ish called The History of Liberalism. But my argument is that this process where, let's say, liberalism was Lockeanized was not just false to the origins of liberalism, but has been catastrophic to its survival.
Mhm. Now, for my reading of your book, Liberalism Against Itself, you argue that there are two strands, so to speak, of liberalism. One is the realist so-called tradition, where the thinkers, especially the Cold War ones, emphasize the limits of human nature and also the less
Yes.
flattering aspects of human nature, and thus
Yes.
they argue for sober-minded I guess, adoption of the ideas of the Enlightenment. And there are, on the other side, the more idealistic strand, best characterized by Rousseau and also the German idealists, I suppose Kant and Hegel and Marx. And it is the more idealistic tradition that you are arguing for. You believe that they should be revived as the liberals, and those like Hobbes and Locke should be in some ways discarded. So I'd like to hear you make the case for that.
Well, this dichotomy to which you're gesturing actually has its origins, as many of the Cold Warriors themselves understood, in Christianity before liberalism existed. And it really is, it comes from the contrast between so-called Augustinian Christianity, which emphasizes fallenness and sin, and Pelagian Christianity, which emphasizes the possibility that humans can prepare themselves for their own salvation, and that original sin is not definitive. And liberals basically inherit secularized versions of this. What is, I think, very interesting is that it's the Pelagian view which has the upper hand at the beginning. And we can look at figures like Tocqueville, as well as the non-liberal Hegel, who has a lot of importance for later liberals, as part of this Pelagian tradition that's hopeful and optimistic about the possibility of realizing a kind of utopia on earth of freedom and equality. After all liberals believe that in some sense humans are or ought to be free and equal and liberated from the constraints of the past, God's will, the father's law, the dictates of tradition. And the Pelagians just kind of dream big about what it will be like for liberalism to complete the job of liberation. The Cold Warriors basically say all of those ideas are a road to serfdom, and even when meant in a liberal vein, are really a kind of sop to the Soviets, and will fool a lot of people into backing the Soviets and their tyrannical power. And so they say the truth is that human beings are not open to reform because they're either sinful, since a lot of Cold War liberals out straightforwardly revive Augustinian Christianity, as I show, or they say the same thing in a more secular guise. So one of my chapters is about the attempt to make Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis the foundation of Cold War liberalism, which was basically saying human beings are so aggressive and nasty that they should be kept in check and not liberated. And if you ask people who have these views, well, what about the freedom and equality that liberalism has stood for and that lit the whole world on fire with its promise? They say those are lures and they have to be abandoned to some extent. And I think that I have a couple of criticisms of that view. One is that, once again, it fails on its own terms if the Cold War liberalism ultimately can't sustain a liberal regime, as we're seeing across the world. But I also have a kind of more basic criticism that I think we should dream big, and that the earlier liberals were right and the pessimists wrong.
I see. I suppose there lies my disagreements with your criticisms of the
Okay.
Cold War liberals. I think
Okay.
the assessments of the traditions that dates back to, I suppose, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and the Cold War liberals inherited, and also, of course, reaching back to Augustine too, is the flawedness of human nature
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
in some ways a certain unchangingness of human nature.
Right.
I suppose what the Cold War liberals got correct is that they believe that there should be certain institutions that can flourish the better parts of humanity and also constrains the less than desirable parts of human nature, and that it's that I
But that's
think.
not, that's, I don't think we disagree there. And
Okay.
I think you're, I wouldn't say it's right to cast the disagreement in that way, because all liberals think that bad things can happen and that there are risks in politics. And especially in an unreformed society, there are going to be people who want to dominate others or just, you know, hurt them. And of course, we use state power to keep people free from harm. No one could reject that view. The question is whether we just leave it there and treat human nature as so sinful, so unreformable that we just set up a kind of prison state. That was, I agree with you, that was Thomas Hobbes's view. It wasn't John Locke's view.
Mhm.
Who at least tolerated the risk of revolution before putting just, another king in charge. But I think the early liberals said, let's experiment with our institutions to see if we can moderate the need to have the state repress evil by making people better through education. It's not like you just, pretend people are angels. What you do is reject the conclusion in advance that they're demons. So that's the difference we're talking about.
That's it. Um, so I guess why should we reject this skepticism that the Cold War liberals and their predecessors have on human nature then?
Well, I let me offer two possible reasons. First, we look at why the Cold War liberals made the conclusions they did, and and suggest that the reasons weren't sufficient. It's totally, I think, noble to respond to a horrifying world, which the mid 20th century was, and conclude that people are evil. But what if you overlearn from the situation you're in and you place unnecessary constraints on liberalism? And then I think there's just a kind of broader picture where uh, someone with your views, if you stop the clock in 1700, might say, well, the best we can do is have a repressive king, and any attempt to make people freer and more equal will lead to ruin. And now we would look back and say, my goodness, look at all of the emancipation that has been possible over the last 200 years. Look at how it's possible to have democracy rather than monarchy. And, the question is whether it's just early days for emancipation. What I'm saying is that what if we look at the last couple of 100 years and conclude that, a certain amount of risk taking has proved tolerable because people aren't so evil that their liberation will lead to tyranny. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And so we have to be careful and cautious and have some fear about our fellow human beings. But if we just allowed fear to rule us, we just would never have gone beyond Thomas Hobbes. And he's the one who recommended a kind of totalitarian state. And the Cold War liberals, um, you know, uh, clearly reject that. But then why wouldn't, looking back, they accept the need for a little bit more experimentation, a little bit more hope, and that we could become more perfect, if not perfect?
So I suppose any critic of the idealism would point to the French Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution as, the consequences of
Yes,
idealism gone wrong. Um,
correct.
it's quite clear that the ideas that animated the French Revolution stems from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I believe it was Saul Bellow that says that the words of uh, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a fuel to Robespierre's killing machine. Just a paraphrase there, and it can be quite easily argued that Karl Marx's ideas, were the fuel to the fire that is the Bolshevik Revolution. So
Sure, but
it,
Marx wasn't a liberal, so I would prefer to have the argument about the French Revolution,
okay.
since, I mean, isn't that fair? I mean, I'm not proposing to rescue Marxism. I'm proposing to rescue liberalism from the Cold War liberals. So, and then if you look at the French Revolution, well, it set the world on fire. And it's, of course, true that some people died. I mean, in part, that was because the whole of the old regime, all the kings of the day, declared war on the French Revolution. And the forces of reaction, like in the Vendée, rose up. And in that kind of state of international and domestic conflict, there's going to be lives lost, in the same way that liberals killed a lot of people in World War II, and have thrown a lot of people in jail, in the course of the Civil War in the United States. So it can't just be the claim that violence happened. Liberal states have probably killed as many tens of millions as the Soviet Union, and way more than died in the French Revolution. So I guess I'm saying the French Revolution had good sides and bad sides. And if we just look at the 19th and 20th century, it has been an immense inspiration to all of those claiming that they deserve to live in circumstances of freedom and equality. And of course, it's very difficult to achieve those things, and mistakes are made, no doubt.
What do you suppose would be the positive impact of the French Revolution, either contemporaneously or historically?
Well, the way I learned European history, at the time of the French Revolution, there are aristocracies and monarchs. And there's no thought that people are born free or equal. They are still living according to their station. A few nobles, one king, and then everyone else as their servants. And this idea is totally rejected. And it's thanks to the French Revolution, which first transformed Western Europe, and then Eastern Europe, and then the whole world, and reset people's expectations in the name of the idea that humans are free and equal. You don't agree with that? I mean, I'm just thinking about modern history, and it's a history of emancipation, so all of it tracing directly back to the French Revolution.
I think
So they're, for better and worse, I'm not saying that mistakes weren't made, but unless you believe that feudalism and the Middle Ages were better than modernity, then you have to award credit to the French Revolution for unleashing modern politics.
I think it can be successfully argued that the French Revolution has more of a historical impact, at least in the realm of the West, than the American Revolution. Um, and but it is also true that since the American Revolution, America has one republic, and since the French Revolution, it has scuttled between republic and monarchy and empire, and then a few
Yes,
more republics
that is
afterward. So I suppose
that's
there are.
fair. Remember, though, that America had a civil war in which more died than in French history.
Mhm. Yes, I guess
So,
what I'm arguing in favor of is that there are certain ways in which ideas proposed by the Enlightenment figures can achieve like a successful republic, and there are ways that it could not. And the American revolutions proved that it could, and the French Revolution proved that, well, at that time it couldn't, at least.
well, you're certainly right that the French Revolution failed to achieve a stable regime, and actually the later revolutions did too. So there's just you're just correct about that. But the question is, is it just this enduring stability of a regime that's the criterion of success? Because the enduring stability of the American regime, even if you leave out the Civil War, which you shouldn't, is, I think not based on the freedom and equality of all human beings. It's based on a tax revolt of white men who tolerated the endurance of slavery and later created an apartheid system to replace it. And if you compare the French Revolution, you see anti-racism and critiques of patriarchy and imperialism from the first, with pretty big effects. And you also see much more movement on this so-called social question as a result of the French Revolution, in which people said it really matters what the material circumstances are that make possible a regime of freedom and equality. So once again, if you want to judge America a comparative success, I think it's pretty dubious, because you're first leaving out the US Civil War, and you're second saying that political stability under a single constitution is more important than everything else. The truth is, if you take a vote, people in France today would prefer to live there than in the United States. And most people in the world would prefer to live in Western Europe than in the United States. And that's because people are freer and more equal outside the United States than in it.
Now, you've previously mentioned that you didn't want to argue for Marxism, but you wanted to argue for a more idealistic liberalism. I read a pretty interesting piece in the American Post-Liberal. It was by Gary Hutchins. He wrote about how if liberalism, and he argued for both the idealistic and the so-called realistic kind, both strands can
Yes,
lead to Marxism, in that, well, in liberalism
for sure.
promises freedom and equality for all men. Well, if that is the case, then there should be a state or a state of affairs that ensures both of these facts. So if there
Yes.
lies an instance, for instance, that the more idealistic liberal detects that, well, this is not unfair, or it's
Yes.
not unequal, then the state can intervene and remedy it, perhaps at the expense of
Absolutely.
the freedom accorded to them by liberalism. So how can you stop that kind of liberalism?
Well, no, I agree with that, but I don't think that makes uh, it necessarily Marxist. It depends on what Marxism is. Now, I think it's very important that Karl Marx inherits some liberal ideals, and when he says the purpose of his proposals is to make the fulfillment of each person depend on the fulfillment of all, he's voicing a liberal ideal. But I also argue that liberals could learn a lot from Marxism and did in the later 19th century. In particular, when they concluded that the conditions for the enjoyment of freedom are what liberalism has to secure. And that therefore, older liberal commitments to protecting freedom of contract in the marketplace, or the sacrosanct right of private property, had to be abandoned by liberals on liberal grounds for freedom and equality to come about. And you can say that made liberalism Marxist, but what I think is important is that it wasn't an argument for terror. It was an argument for things like progressive taxation and public use of land, which basically all free countries accept nowadays. There's no more laissez-faire system with the night watchman state. And so if the author and the post-liberal says that like contemporary Denmark is really a communist state, then he's on firm ground in his argument. But if we come back to planet Earth and say, well, no, a free and fair society can be liberal and not become the Soviet Union in the process, then he's wrong, because it turns out that liberalism can evolve, can take on board certain commitments to fairness, consistent with freedom, and avoid devolving into tyranny and totalitarianism. If that's what you think Marxism entails. I don't. I think there's a lot of overlap between liberalism and Marxism. And even if you want to get into this, the Soviet Union betrayed Marxism as much as realized it. So, but the main point would have to be that, again, if you assume in advance that liberalism is about protecting the property rights of white males, and anything we do to change that is on the road to the Soviet Union, then you're not going to really see a lot in my book. Where I would defend it is that we've learned in modern history that we need more freedom and more equality for more kinds of people. And if that means interfering with what liberals once defended as, freedom of contract and, sacrosanct property rights, then liberalism has to change. And it did, obviously.
Mhm. Now, I did my last term paper on Robert La Follette. So he is
Okay.
so he is I suppose an example of what you call a progressive liberal. I find much to admire about the guy, even though
Me too.
many things I find quite disagreeable about him. And I suppose you would add Georg Hegel into your canon of progressive liberals. And again,
I would say he was more a source for liberals than one himself.
that's it. Okay, thank you for clarifying. So, I think it is true that Hegel is very much influential to the American progressive movement that started in the early 20th century. Many of the best and brightest American philosophers, I think John Dewey was one of them, studied in Germany. And
Absolutely. Absolutely. A Dewey unthinkable without the Hegelian tradition. Agreed.
now, in your book, you profiled Karl Popper, the great Cold War liberal, and I think one of the things that would Popper would find quite scary is the thing that Hegel would find triumphant, and that is the idea that history has a direction and it has an end, so to speak. And for people like Popper, it means that as humans, we can perhaps in a Pelagian fashion achieve this end of history.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so is inherently very progressive. What I worry about with
Yes.
any sort of movement that claims itself to be progressive is that what do you do with the people who are not on board? Um, so for perhaps the Soviet Union, you suppress dissenting voice, or of course in Nazi Germany you kill them
No.
all.
Well, no. I mean, to me, that's a dichotomy that we have to reject. Your premise seems to be either we do nothing or we engage in terrorism. And if I propose that, slavery, chattel slavery had to be ended, surely the choices were not just leaving slavery, the slave system as it was, or embracing Soviet terror. There, it's absolutely true that certain practices have to be suppressed. Uh, it's not like the people have to be killed unless they decide to declare war, as in my country uh, occurred. I mean, that's what the Civil War was about. But there might be other situations where the Hegelian liberal state decides that more taxation is needed, and it's not as if it's about killing the wealthy, it's about taking their money for the sake of the freedom and equality of all. And should the wealthy rise up in revolt, well, then there's going to be another civil war, but they started it. So to me, it can't be correct to say that either there's society just the way it is now, or there's a road to serfdom. We have to think that there are alternative options, and you must think so.
Mhm. Yes, you've mentioned the road to serfdom, and I would count Friedrich Hayek as one of the Cold War liberals, even though he wasn't one of the six thinkers that you've profiled.
Okay. I think he was very close to the Cold War liberals, and if you want, you could, broaden the category to include him.
I believe he was one of the key architects of this program or this proposal in Mont Pelerin, France. This
He
I think,
organized it. It's Switzerland, yeah.
mhm. And there are I've read many people who says that that is where so-called neoliberalism began its roots. Um, of course, Hayek, being an economist, he favors economic freedom. Well, I suppose as well as political freedom, but he focuses on economic freedom, and he argues that any sort of restraint or restriction against this economic freedom also leads to the restriction of political freedom. And why do you believe that this is, well, as you put it, a false dichotomy?
Well, it's true in a certain sense that economics is part of politics. So if the state says that you can't do certain things economically or with your property, or you have to pay taxes, your political freedom is being infringed. But it's the question is whether it's justifiable. Uh, people's political freedom is infringed all the time. Uh, their stop signs put up, which require them to slow their cars. There are speed limits, which require them to slow their cars. There's sales tax. There's, at the limit, even deprivation of liberty it after conviction for crime. And the question always is the restriction of freedom justifiable? We can't have a theory that every restriction of liberty is illiberal. No liberal thinks that there can be no restrictions. So that's an anarchist position, not a liberal one. So then the dispute with Hayek is that he vastly overstated the required, zone of freedom, which cannot be restricted. And so liberals like me say, well, we just use the state more than Hayek wanted. And there's a moral argument for that actually those uses of state power to restrict freedom are justifiable in the name of freedom and equality themselves. And most important, Hayek's claim that the kinds of restrictions he opposed would lead to tyranny has been proven false. In his book, The Road to Serfdom, it's basically an attack on planning, using the state to plan the economy, because actually, if you read the book, Hayek was very favorable to things like universal health care. And even, something like a universal basic income has been defended by neoliberals like Milton Friedman. So the empirical question is whether planning the economy leads to tyranny. Well, that's not what happened in Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. And there's no reason to think it would. There's no reason to think that higher levels of taxation are tyrannical, et cetera, et cetera. So and unless I'm misunderstanding the question, it seems like the answer is just that we have a disagreement about what forms of the restriction of freedom are justifiable and which are not.
Yeah, I think so. So another thinker which was profiled in the book is Hannah Arendt, which I found rather surprising because for the most part, I don't really consider her part of the liberal tradition at all, although she was
I don't either.
important Cold War thinker.
I say very openly outright that she wasn't a liberal, therefore she wasn't a Cold War liberal.
Nevertheless, her account of totalitarianism is still massively read today, even by myself. So, do you have like an alternative, so to speak, explanation for why totalitarianism came to be?
Well, I would distinguish between right wing and left wing forms of so-called totalitarianism, because I think one of the unhelpful features of that concept is that it homogenizes very different phenomena. And the uses of the concept also tend to stigmatize the expansion of state power as such, which liberals depend on, and which non-totalitarian states in the middle of the 20th century were very famous for doing. So to me, to go back to the last answer, we shouldn't have a discussion about the essence of totalitarianism as if there is such a thing. We should have a discussion about what limits on freedom are justified in the name of freedom itself. And the Nazi regime was a racialist regime that, interpreted social Darwinism in an exterminationist direction and attempted to create a welfare state for a master race. But that has nothing to do with freedom. It has to do with it's a social Darwinist project. And the Soviet Union did absolutely make claims on freedom and equality, but the forms of repression it adopted didn't serve those ends. It set them back. Now, if the point of the totalitarianism concept is that these regimes developed similar features, there's some truth to that, but there's also big differences. For example, the Soviet Union's never built death camps, only, concentration and work camps. So I'm not sure, Hannah Arendt's book is very bad on this point because she doesn't talk about the death camps at all. And in fact, was reading the wrong books to think about these regimes when she wrote the last third of The Origins of Totalitarianism. So my basic answer is that we should reject the concept and then think about where exactly these kinds of regimes go wrong, because I think they go wrong in very different ways.
Now, perhaps a point that I've read in the book that I can agree with you the most on is that um, sometime after the 19th century, and of course, beginning with the Cold War, liberals, or at least people who call themselves liberals, begin to become, I suppose, defensive. In other
Yes.
words, liberalism has become, I think, a form of conservatism. No longer
Yes,
was the
we agree about that.
Yes, no longer was there an impulse to change politics or society or to emancipate the wealth of mankind.
Yeah.
There's now in defense of course the ideas that was established a few centuries ago against more idealistic form of politics or more reactionary forms of politics from both the left and the right. I wonder if that has carried out into the post-Cold War war as well.
Well, yes and no. I mean, so there are certainly counterexamples. And when you think of neoconservative foreign policy, it seems like ambitious and utopian, in the wrong way. And not, even though it's called neoconservative, there's a way in which it wasn't conservative at all.
Yeah.
But those are not the policies that Cold War liberals backed. And I don't think that they have defined completely the era since the end of the Cold War. What has is neoliberalism, which many liberals have ignored because of their devotion to Cold War liberal tropes. And in general, cold liberals since the Cold War have missed the point of the neoliberal era and therefore failed to envision an ambitious liberalism to counter neoliberalism and its consequences in the populist era. So I think there's a lot of Cold War liberalism still left around. And it's really for that reason that I wrote the book, because it seems that even in the face of populism, liberals continue to lean on a crutch of Cold War liberalism rather than recognizing that it's their own failures of ambition and optimism that have caused the dire straits of liberalism today.
Now, Patrick Deneen, who reviewed your book in American Affairs, had a slightly different take on it. He argued that liberalism failed because it has achieved its goals and with unforeseen consequences. So I wonder what are your thoughts on Deneen as well as the post-liberal movement that's going on right now?
Well, the post-liberal movement is really a pre-liberal movement. It's the argument of those who never liked liberalism to begin with and would prefer the pre-modern world. And one of the characters in my book, Judith Shklar, says, well, these people come by their views honestly. It's just that liberals displace them. And they're only getting a hearing today because of the kind of liberal failures that I talk about. I think it's reasonable for Patrick Deneen to identify some of those failures. I think his diagnosis of them is wrong, that they're the consequence of liberalism. And I think his cure is wrong, that we would go back before liberalism for a better order. So, my basic difference from Patrick, who is very eloquent and smart, is that he thinks liberalism failed, and I think it never was tried.
So finally, I suppose since I mentioned John Dewey, I think I certainly think that he is one of the more underrated thinkers of the current like philosophical classroom right now.
Me
I think
too.
more people should read
Me
John
too.
Dewey.
I
So
agree with you.
I wonder how would you characterize John Dewey as an example of like this revival, a more progressive liberalism that you've mentioned?
Absolutely. And Democrat as well. So if Dewey were hegemonic today in the way he was in the 1930s, I think we'd be much better off. But the Cold War liberals who knew about him set on him with a vengeance, or kindred figures. So Isaiah Berlin devoted his career to trashing the neo-Hegelian political philosophy of his youth. And so did the rest of the Cold War liberals. And Dewey was dethroned in the 1940s. And the rest is history. Liberalism is in dire straits because we read Locke instead of Dewey.
That's it. So well, final question. What should a viable post-Cold War politic look like?
Just to draw on out the implications of what I've been saying before, I think liberalism has to return to promising and providing emancipation in more forms to more people. And if it can't keep its promises, it deserves to be rejected. Um, if you ask why Marxism arose and the Soviet Union could be founded in the first place, it's because liberals failed to offer a credible option to millions of dispossessed people in poverty. Today, the economic situation is somewhat different, but millions across the world are rejecting liberals because liberals don't have anything credible to offer. And so my proposal is that liberals give their own ideas one more chance, but they have to rescue their tradition from its Cold War transformation if they're going to do so.
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Samuel Moyn, for joining the show.
Thank you for having me.